This was not confusion. This was a choice. They thought they won. They believed they finally got what they wanted. But there is one thing the narcissist never planned for, and it is already in motion. If you are here right now, this is not random. You are not just dealing with a breakup. You are dealing with betrayal. And somewhere deep inside, there is a question that has not left you. Why would they do this to me? Why would the narcissist choose that person over me? And the answer is not what most people tell you. It was never because you were not enough. It is because what you were required, something they did not have. This is where the illusion has to break. People like to soften the truth after betrayal. They say maybe the narcissist was confused. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe they did not understand what they had. But that is not what happened. The narcissist knew. They saw you clearly. They saw your loyalty. They saw the way you showed up without manipulation, without games, without hidden motives. They understood the value of what was in front of them. And they made a decision. Not a mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A decision. They chose what was easier to control. They chose what did not require growth. They chose what allowed them to stay exactly as they were, without being exposed. Because you were not something they could manage. You required honesty. You required consistency. You required alignment between words and actions. And for the narcissist, that is where everything becomes uncomfortable. Scripture makes this clear in John 3:20. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. You were not rejected because you lacked something. You were stepped away from because you revealed something. The narcissist did not walk away because you were not enough. They walked away because they were not enough for someone like you. What they chose is karma, not destiny. What the narcissist stepped into was never meant to build a future. It only appeared that way on the surface. It looked like connection. It sounded like passion. And for a moment it felt like something real. But what holds a relationship together is not intensity. It is truth. And there was no truth in what they chose. This is where many people misunderstand what they are witnessing. They think the narcissist found something better. They assume the other person offered something deeper, something more aligned, something that replaced what you had. But that is not what happened here. What they entered was a karmic connection, not a divine alignment, not a relationship built on purpose, but a cycle designed to reveal what both of them refused to confront within themselves. A karmic connection does not come to elevate. It comes to expose. It forces patterns to repeat until they can no longer be ignored. And when two people carry the same distortions, they do not heal each other. They amplify each other. That is exactly what is happening here. The narcissist did not meet someone pure and become better. They met someone who matched their operating level. Someone who understood manipulation because they also used it. Someone who recognized control because they also depended on it. Someone who did not challenge their behavior, but participated in it. There is no stability in that kind of bond, because when both people are trying to gain, no one is giving. When both people are trying to control, no one is safe. And when both people are avoiding truth, nothing real can grow. Scripture warns about this kind of foundation in Matthew 7:26. Everyone who hears these words and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The structure may stand for a moment, but it cannot survive pressure. When the storm comes, it does not weaken slowly. It collapses completely. That is the nature of what they chose. It is not designed to last. It is designed to break. They were drawn to each other because they operated on the same frequency. Not the frequency of love, but the frequency of avoidance. Avoidance of accountability. Avoidance of growth. Avoidance of anything that would require them to change. You were different. You did not match that frequency. You brought something that required honesty. You brought something that demanded alignment between what is said and what is done. And that is why the narcissist could not remain where you were, because your presence disrupted their patterns. The karmic connection does the opposite. It allows those patterns to continue. It creates an environment where manipulation is not challenged, where truth is not required, and where both people can remain exactly as they are while convincing themselves they have found something meaningful. But what they have found is not peace. It is a mirror, a reflection of everything they refuse to face. And over time, that reflection becomes unbearable, because you cannot build something real on a foundation that is false. You cannot create stability from instability, and you cannot escape the consequences of what you are choosing by hiding inside something that feels easier. What they chose was not destiny, it was a cycle. And that cycle is already turning against them. The deception was real, and your discernment was right. There was a moment when something shifted inside you. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. A quiet awareness that something was no longer aligned. The words still sounded the same, but they carried a different weight. The behavior looked familiar, but it no longer matched the energy behind it. And what made it even more unsettling was this: you could not prove it at first, but you could feel it. That is where many people begin to doubt themselves, because when truth is not immediately visible, the mind tries to fill in the gaps with logic. It tries to explain away what the spirit is already detecting. It tries to protect you from discomfort by suggesting simpler explanations. Maybe you are overthinking. Maybe you are imagining things. Maybe you are just reacting emotionally. But what you were sensing was not confusion. It was misalignment. And misalignment does not appear randomly. It appears when something is being hidden. When you finally gathered the courage to address it, you were not met with honesty. You were met with resistance. Not just denial, but something far more calculated. The narcissist did not simply say no. They redirected the focus back onto you. They questioned your perception. They challenged your memory. They reframed the situation in a way that made you look like the problem. That is not a misunderstanding. That is gaslighting. It is a deliberate attempt to destabilize your sense of reality so that they can continue operating without being exposed. And the more you tried to make sense of it, the more they distorted it. Because deception requires maintenance. It is not a single lie. It is a system of lies that must stay consistent. Every detail must align with the story they are trying to protect. Every response must reinforce the illusion they are trying to preserve. And that takes effort. That is why, over time, the cracks begin to show. The inconsistencies start to repeat. The explanations become weaker. The timing no longer makes sense. And what once felt uncertain begins to form a pattern. This is the moment where your discernment becomes undeniable. Because truth does not need to be forced. It reveals itself through repetition. It shows up again and again until it can no longer be ignored. Scripture speaks clearly about this in Luke 8:17. For nothing is hidden that will not be revealed, nor anything secret that will not be known and come to light. That is not just a spiritual principle. It is a law of exposure. What is hidden creates pressure, and pressure always seeks release. The narcissist believed they could control the narrative. They believed that as long as they managed your perception, they could continue what they were doing without consequence. But they underestimated something critical. They underestimated your ability to perceive beyond what was being shown. You were not reacting randomly. You were responding to signals they could not fully conceal. And even when you did not have all the details, you had enough to know that something was wrong. That internal signal was not weakness. It was alignment with truth. The deception was real. The betrayal was intentional. And your awareness was not a flaw. It was the very thing that kept you from being completely lost inside their illusion. What they tried to hide is already moving toward exposure. And what you sensed from the beginning is about to be confirmed in ways that cannot be denied. The true nature of what they built, a dirty exchange, not love. At some point, the illusion has to be stripped away, not gently, not partially, but completely. Because what the narcissist and the karmic created together was never love. It only borrowed the language of love to disguise something far more transactional. If you remove the words they used, if you step back from the story they tried to present, what remains is not connection, it is exchange. An exchange of advantage, an exchange of control, an exchange of unmet needs being temporarily fed without ever being healed. This is where clarity becomes uncomfortable, because from the outside, it may have looked like they moved on into something real. It may have appeared as though they found happiness, as though they found alignment, as though they found something that replaced what you had. But what they entered was not a relationship built on truth. It was a system built on mutual use. One person offering access, the other offering validation. One person seeking power, the other seeking gain, and both believing they are winning, but in reality, both are losing. Because when a connection is built on what each person can extract rather than what they can give, it does not create stability. It creates dependency, a dependency that slowly becomes toxic because it is rooted in need, not in truth. The narcissist does not enter these dynamics to love. They enter to secure control, to maintain an image, to feel significant without doing the internal work required to become whole. And the karmic does not enter to build something lasting either. They enter because they recognize an opportunity to gain influence, attention, or leverage. That is why this connection feels intense at the beginning, not because it is deep, but because it is fueled by imbalance. And imbalance creates friction. Friction creates energy, and that energy can easily be mistaken for passion by those who do not recognize what is underneath it. But passion that is built on distortion does not evolve. It burns, and eventually, it burns everything attached to it. Scripture speaks to this kind of dynamic in James 3:16. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Where self-interest is the foundation, confusion will follow, instability will follow, and what looks functional from a distance will begin to collapse under its own weight. Because neither of them is grounded in truth, they are both performing roles that benefit them in the moment, adjusting behavior to maintain advantage, shifting tone to preserve control. But beneath all of that, there is no real alignment. There is no shared purpose. There is no foundation that can withstand pressure. And pressure is coming, because no one can sustain a false dynamic indefinitely. The narcissist believes they are in control, but control in a relationship like this is never stable. It shifts constantly. One moment they dominate, the next moment they are reacting. One moment they feel powerful, the next moment they feel threatened. And the karmic is not passive in this. They are observing, calculating, adjusting, learning where the weaknesses are, learning how to influence outcomes, learning how to gain the upper hand when the opportunity presents itself. So what you are witnessing is not a partnership, it is a silent competition. Two people trying to outmaneuver each other while pretending to stand together. And that kind of structure cannot hold, because eventually one will push too far, one will take more than the other is willing to give. One will expose something the other was trying to keep hidden, and when that happens, everything shifts. What once felt like agreement becomes tension. What once looked like unity becomes division. What once appeared stable begins to fracture, because there was never love holding it together, only advantage, only need, only control. And those things do not create peace, they create collapse. If you are hearing this and something inside you is starting to connect the pieces, do not ignore it. If this resonates with what you have experienced, take a moment and acknowledge that clarity. Type 77 inches the comments as a way of grounding yourself in what you now see, because awareness is the turning point. It is where confusion ends and truth begins to take its place. You were not replaced by something better. You were stepped away from so they could step into something easier. And what is easy at the beginning often becomes destructive in the end. What they built is already consuming itself, and it will not stop until there is nothing left to take. This was a test, and they failed it. Not every turning point in life announces itself. Some arrive quietly, disguised as simple choices, a moment that seems small, a decision that feels convenient, a path that looks easier in the moment but carries weight far beyond what is immediately visible. That is what this was. Not just a situation, not just a betrayal, but a test of alignment, a test of integrity, a test of what each person would choose when faced with truth versus temptation. You were part of that moment. The narcissist was part of that moment, and the outcome was not determined by circumstance. It was determined by choice. You felt something shift, something that did not sit right. And even without having every answer, you did not force yourself into something that contradicted what you knew was real. You did not reshape your standards just to keep what was already breaking. You did not abandon your sense of truth to compete with something false. That matters, because integrity is not proven when everything is clear. It is revealed when things become uncertain, and you still refuse to compromise what is right. The narcissist faced that same moment, but from a different position. They were presented with something that looked easier, something that required less accountability, less growth, less internal change, and they chose it. Not because they were unaware, but because it aligned with what they were willing to maintain within themselves. They chose what did not challenge them. They chose what allowed them to avoid responsibility. They chose what gave them something quickly, without requiring anything real in return. And in doing so, they made a decision that extends beyond the moment itself. Because certain choices do not just affect the present, they redirect everything that follows. This was one of those choices. They did not simply walk away from a person. They walked away from something that required truth. And once that line is crossed knowingly, it cannot be undone by intention alone. This was not a mistake they slipped into. It was a path they stepped onto. And now, everything that comes from that path is already unfolding. The collapse has begun, and now they are destroying each other. What was built here was never stable. It was never grounded in truth, never protected by integrity, never sustained by anything real. It was held together by advantage, by secrecy, by the illusion that both sides could keep taking without ever being exposed. That kind of structure does not break slowly. It turns, and that is exactly what is happening now. This connection did not begin with love. It began with use. One side seeking access to power, position, or opportunity. The other seeking control, validation, or dominance. Both entering with an agenda, both believing they could benefit without consequence. At first, that agreement feels functional. Both are getting something. Both are playing their roles. Both are feeding the illusion that this is working. But underneath that surface, something else is forming. Because when two people enter a connection to use each other, they do not build trust. They collect leverage. Every conversation becomes information. Every moment becomes observation. Every weakness becomes something that can be used later. And that is where the shift begins. What once felt like alignment starts to feel like calculation. What once felt like connection begins to reveal itself as positioning. The same dynamic that brought them together now begins to turn against them, because neither side is safe. There is no real loyalty in something that was built on self-interest. There is no protection in a connection where both sides know exactly how the other operates. And slowly, the energy changes. The same closeness becomes tension. The same attraction becomes suspicion. The same agreement becomes silent competition. Now both are watching for signs of betrayal, watching for shifts in behavior, watching for anything that suggests the other side is gaining more than they are. And once that awareness fully settles in, the connection stops being cooperative. It becomes strategic. This is where destruction begins to move from internal to external, because what was once hidden starts to surface in moments of pressure. Words begin to slip, reactions become sharper, the things that were covered up no longer stay contained, and now, instead of protecting the connection, both sides begin protecting themselves. That changes everything, because in a dynamic like this, self-protection always comes at the cost of the other. Information that was once kept private becomes a tool. Secrets that were once hidden become leverage. Details that were once shared in confidence begin to surface in conflict, because survival inside something unstable requires control. And when control begins to slip, exposure becomes the weapon. This is where the destruction becomes visible. The same connection that was built in secrecy now starts unraveling in the open. The same person who was once chosen becomes the one holding pieces of truth that cannot be erased. And those pieces do not stay silent. They come out in arguments, in reactions, in moments where control is lost and truth forces its way through. Now both sides are no longer building anything. Both sides are tearing something down. Reputation begins to crack. Trust from others begins to weaken. The image that was carefully maintained begins to fall apart. And the more each side tries to regain control, the more damage is created. Because every attempt to defend becomes another exposure. Every attempt to shift blame reveals more of what was hidden. Every move to protect self pulls the other side further down. This is mutual destruction in motion. Scripture makes this unavoidable in Mark 3:25. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. This is that house, divided at its core from the very beginning, held together only by temporary gain, now fully exposed as unstable, fractured, and unsustainable. And what happens next is not repair, because once both sides realize there is nothing left to protect, the focus shifts completely, from maintaining the illusion to surviving the fallout. And in that shift, the final stage begins. Not just the end of a relationship, but the destruction of everything that was built inside it. Together, the truth is coming out, and it will not stop. There comes a point where what was hidden can no longer remain contained, not because there is a decision to reveal it, but because the structure that was holding it together has already begun to break. Up to this point, everything depended on control. Control of the narrative, control of perception, control of what was shown and what was kept out of sight. As long as that control remained intact, the illusion could continue. But once the connection started turning against itself, that control weakened. And when control weakens, truth does not stay buried. It begins to leak. Not all at once, not in a dramatic announcement, but in ways that cannot be stopped. Inconsistencies start to surface. Details begin to slip out. Conversations no longer align with what was previously said. And what once felt contained begins to spread beyond their reach. This is not exposure coming from the outside. This is exposure coming from within, because the same dynamic that allowed deception to exist is now forcing it into the open. What was once hidden in private moments now comes out in conflict. Words that were never meant to be spoken begin to surface in anger. Information that was once protected begins to be used as defense, not because there is a desire to reveal truth, but because there is a need to protect self. And in that process, both sides begin to expose each other. Secrets are no longer safe. History is no longer protected. Intentions are no longer hidden behind performance. What was built in secrecy is now being undone by the same people who created it. This is where the shift becomes undeniable, because once truth starts moving, it does not stop at the surface. It continues to rise until everything that was covered is brought into view. Scripture speaks directly to this in Luke 12:2. For there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known. That is not symbolic. That is exactly what is happening. What they thought was buried is now becoming visible, and it does not require a public investigation. It does not require outside interference. It unfolds through the pressure they are already creating between themselves. At the same time, there are others who are not as unaware as they once seemed. People who have observed, people who have noticed patterns, people who have seen enough to question what is real. And among them may be someone who knows more than expected, someone who was closer than they should have been, someone who understands the details that were never meant to be shared. And when the timing aligns, that knowledge does not stay silent, because what is unstable internally eventually becomes visible externally. Now the exposure is no longer contained within the connection. It begins to reach outward. Reputation starts to weaken. Trust from others begins to fade. Associations begin to shift. The image that was carefully maintained no longer holds under scrutiny. And the most difficult part of this is not just that truth is coming out. It is that it cannot be controlled. There is no way to manage every detail. No way to rewrite every narrative. No way to prevent what has already begun from continuing. Because once truth moves into the open, it defines everything that follows. The same things that were hidden to maintain an image now become the very things that reshape how everything is seen. The mask does not slowly fade, it falls. And when it does, what is left is not a version that can be adjusted. It is the reality that was always there. There is no return to what it looked like before, because once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. What they tried to keep hidden is no longer separate from them. Karma is in motion, and nothing can stop it. There comes a point where everything that has been building beneath the surface reaches its full and final outcome. Not loudly, not suddenly, but with a certainty that cannot be reversed. What began as a hidden choice has moved through every stage. It moved from secrecy into tension, from tension into conflict, from conflict into exposure. And now it has entered the stage where results are no longer delayed, where nothing remains suspended, and where everything begins to return with full weight. This is not something waiting to happen. This is already in motion. Because once something is built on deception, manipulation, and self-interest, it does not simply collapse and end. It continues to unravel until every part connected to it begins to feel the consequence. It reaches beyond the relationship itself and starts affecting reputation, opportunity, stability, and identity. What was once protected begins to fail. What was once maintained begins to slip. What once appeared stable begins to disappear without resistance. Reputation does not hold under what has now been revealed. Relationships do not remain when trust has been broken at the core. Opportunities do not stay open when what was hidden has now become visible. And this is where everything shifts from internal damage to external consequence. Because what is now exposed does not stay contained. It becomes the lens through which everything else is seen. It reshapes perception. It redefines credibility. It determines what remains and what is removed moving forward. But the deepest part of this is not only what is being lost, it is the awareness of it. There is a recognition forming that cannot be avoided. A quiet understanding that what is unfolding is not random. It is not temporary. It is not something that can be corrected with effort or explanation. It is the result. Control is no longer possible. What once could be managed no longer responds. What once could be hidden no longer stays buried. What once created advantage now produces exposure. And when that realization settles in, there is no way to return to what existed before. Scripture makes this clear in Galatians 6-7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. What was chosen is now returning. What was built without truth is now being dismantled by the absence of truth. What was sustained through control is now collapsing where control no longer has power, and there is no external force required to make this happen. It is already contained within what was created. That is why there is no escape from it. No explanation can reverse it. No adjustment can stabilize it. No performance can restore what was never real. Everything is moving in one direction, toward completion, toward the full consequence of what was set into motion from the very beginning. And this is where the words of C.S. Lewis reveal the deeper reality behind what is unfolding. Good and evil both increase at compound interest. Nothing that was done stayed small. The deception grew, the manipulation expanded, the choices repeated, and over time, what was once a single decision became a structure, a system, a pattern that could no longer hold itself together. Now that pattern is collapsing, and it is collapsing completely, because when something false reaches its limit, it does not repair itself. It ends. What they built will not remain. What they tried to protect will not hold. What they believed they secured will not stay in their hands, because this was never something that could lead to peace. It could only lead here, to the point where everything false reaches its end, to the point where what was done in darkness cannot survive what has now been brought into the light, to the point where karma is no longer an idea. It is a reality, and it is already unfolding.